Hello and welcome to this Guardian Live event. I'm Claire Armistead, an associate editor with The Guardian. Tonight I am delighted to be speaking to the award-winning writer and illustrator duo Neil Gaiman and Colleen Doran about their new graphic novel, Chivalry, which I'm sure lots of you will have seen it, but if you haven't seen it, it is a thing of utter beauty. It's collectible. It's the ultimate coffee table book, only you would not want to spill your coffee on it, let me tell you. It's an adaptation of a short story by Neil and is a sort of charming tale about an unlikely friendship, a very unlikely friendship, and how, more seriously in a way, how sometimes you need to take risks to realise the full potential of your imagination, which I think is a theme that Neil has been addressing in various forms throughout his career. We'll maybe get on to talking a bit more about that. But before we introduce our speakers, here's how the evening will go. Neil, Colleen and I'll talk for about 40 minutes, but we also very much want to hear from you too, so please do get involved. You can start sending your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen right now, if you can see it, and we'll come to them later in the evening. And if you like, please do include your name and where you are joining us from. We always love to find out we've got an international audience, and I'm sure we will have for this because, as you will all know, Neil and Colleen are international stars. So without any more ado, let's meet our guests. First of all, Neil Gaiman, creator of over 30 books for adults and children, including Neil, couldn't decide which ones to pick out, so I picked out Coraline, Stardust, American Gods, Good Omens, and of course The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which I'm very excited about because I've just seen the stage version of it in London's West End. Very warm welcome to you, Neil.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's lovely to see you again.
Neil and I are old buddies. We've done lots of events, haven't we? And including, I seem to remember doing one in a West End theatre where we sort of pretty much had to get you out of the back door while I fought the fans off at the front of the stage. And you did warn me that this might happen, and indeed it did. I didn't believe that it could, but it did. But we don't have any of these problems under these particular circumstances, more's the pity. So secondly, we have Colleen, who's a cartoonist, illustrator and writer who's produced works for Marvel, DC Comics and many others, including the illustrations for Stan Lee's autobiography, Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible. Colleen, welcome. From the Appalachian Mountains.
Hello.
There might be a bear wandering across the back window at any point during proceedings, which seems rather apt. You have to tell us if that bear appears.
He likes to read the bird feeding. Hi, Claire. I do.
Very, very good to see you. And I'm going to start rather cheekily with one of the advanced questions from the audience, because it's a very good one, and also to encourage all the other questions from the audience for later on. And it's from Robert Pivarnik, excuse me if I haven't pronounced it right. And it's, when you two get together, something magic happens. What do you enjoy most about working together? I couldn't have put it better myself. So let's start with Neil.
I've now been working with Colleen for something impossible, like 34 years, maybe 33. I know. And
he doesn't look 34.
I know. I mean, I look old and raddled and hag-ridden, and Colleen has not changed. Her hair is smaller than it was in the 80s. But obviously she was a terribly smart 3-year-old when she drew that first Sandman. But it's always been a delight. It's always made something special. The very first time we worked together was on a story called Facade, Sandman 20, and we did magic, and we knew that it was magic, and we knew that it was magic when we were making it, and we loved working together. We loved talking to each other, and we don't do it very much. Years will go by and we don't talk, and then for some reason I'll need to pick up the phone, or Colleen will need to pick up the phone, and then we talk for 3 hours. We just talk and we talk and we talk and we talk, and it's amazing. And it's like, oh, here's my friend, and we love making art together, and it's magic. So I don't know why it works so well. I think part of it is because Colleen's influences, a lot of them are from outside comics, and we both love talking about them. And part of it is the fact that she's the kind of artist who is never content to be one thing, but is always gloriously reinventing herself and reinventing what she can do with art and doing things that nobody expects. And I just love that. So that will be my answer.
Colleen, what would your answer be?
Thank you for that, Neil. And thank you for your question, Robert. We really appreciate you showing up today and being here. Thank you so much. I felt like I've spent many years trying to become an artist who was good enough to work for Neil. I felt like my early work was very uneven, and I would see these wonderful artists like Charles Vess knocking it out of the ballpark every time, and I would go, boy, can't wait to be like that. I want to be really, really good. And back in the 1990s, I tried doing an adaptation of one of Neil's short stories called Trollbridge, and it was just terrible. It was just awful. It was a little short, little 7 or 8 page thing, and I was like, I just need to get better. I'm not there yet. I need to work at this. And many years later, I came back to Neil and said, would you give me another shot at this? I think I'm there. I think I can do this now. And then he said, yes, go ahead, give this a go. I think it was because I'd worked on that Tori Amos book and had been developing something new with my look. And I said, I'd like to try this with you. Can give me another go at this? And I sat down and I did Trollbridge, and I think it was a real leap up. And then I was like, and then Dark Horse was like, we'd like to have you take another shot at it. And for many years, I've loved Harry Clarke, an Irish artist, and Neil loves Harry Clarke. And he said, let's go with the Harry Clarke look for this. And then tried that again. But he just makes me a better artist. His stories, I know, are going to live like Dickens for centuries. They are just the best. They're going to be around in a century, in 2 centuries. And when I sit down and I work on one of his stories, I want whoever picks up that book to have the same feeling from what I've done illustrating those stories as I got when I sit down and I look at Howard Pyle or Tenniel or Harry Clarke or Herbert, any of these other artists that do these beautiful illustrations for these great books. I'm looking at them 100 and 200 years after they're done, and they seem fresh and beautiful and amazing. And I feel like I owe it to a writer of Neil's caliber to do that, to make sure that when somebody picks up one of those books in 200 years, some person who's never seen that before is going to have that same feeling that I got when I sat down and I picked up that edition of Poe or that Kane Nielsen, East of the Sun, West of the Moon. I want that, and I want to do that for Neil's stories.
So just before we get on to Chivalry, talk a little bit more about what Trollbridge is. And also that was, I think, in the end published in 2016, and that was followed 3 years later by Snow Glass Apples, your retelling of Snow White from the Queen's point of view. Tell us about that, Neil, to begin with, those 2 stories.
They're both fairy tales. And Trollbridge is really my retelling of the 3 Billy Goats Gruff, but sort of reinterpreted and turned upside down and inside out. And Snowglass Apples is Snow White. And again, it was just from, it was a sort of a Snow White. G.K. Chesterton has a line somewhere where he says, you can look at something 999 times, but if you look at it the 1,000th time, you run the risk of actually seeing it. And for me, Snow White was a story I'd known and read and watched and experienced thousands of times in my life. And then I was reading Neil Phillips' Penguin Book of English Folk Tales somewhere around 1994. And he had a version of Snow White in there, and I read it. And I remember just going, hang on, what kind of person has skin white as snow, hair black as coal, lips as red as blood, and gets to lie in a coffin for months or possibly years and then get up again? And for that matter, what kind of prince is riding past and says, whoa, that dead girl in that coffin, I'm in love. Please bring that coffin back to my castle. So, and I thought, oh, I've just seen this thing for the first time and now I have to write it. And it's the longest story I've ever written in the shortest amount of time. I wrote that entire story in a day. So both of them were ways of looking at fairy stories. And what I loved about them was that in each case, Colleen, years later, came along and wanted to tell them in very different ways, and in each time sort of reinventing what comics was. One of the things that fascinates me about all three books, those and Chivalry, is they aren't panels and word balloons, although Colleen can do panels and word balloons just as well as anybody. We've been doing that for years. We did it in Sandman. But in each case, it's her reinventing how to put images onto a page and how to make the words, which we always have Todd Klein letter, because Todd Klein is the very best in the whole world, and big shout out for Todd Klein here. And how you make the words integrate with the pictures. And it fascinates me that each time she reinvents herself and how she's going to do it.
So, Colleen, you bring an aesthetic to each one has its own palette. And you mentioned Harry Clarke for Troll Bridge, but then for Snowglass Apples, you picked up the arts and crafts style of Jessie Bays, didn't you? Why did you? Why you're a bit? And this is relevant to Chivalry as well.
For Trollbridge, there's kind of a joke behind the art for Trollbridge. For Trollbridge, I remember somebody came to me and they said, "But the art for this looks like a choose your own adventure book," and I said, "That's exactly the point. It is a choose your own adventure book. It's about a young man at three pivotal points in his life making life-changing choices. So it's meant to look like classic, highly rendered children's books. And then with Snowglass Apples, I went with Harry Clarke, which is a highly detailed pen and ink style. And on that book, I actually referenced his paintings and stained glass. I went to Dublin to take photographs of his original art so that I could use them as a palette in Photoshop when I painted the work. And then for Chivalry, my primary reference point was this artist, Alberto Zagorski. He is a little-known calligrapher and illuminator from the late 1800s to early 1900s. And he did this version of Le Mort d'Arthur. And he did about 100 illuminated manuscripts over the course of a couple of decades. Very few people know who he is. The famous bookbinder Zagorski and Sutcliffe, he was part of that originally, and then he went to, I think it's called Riviere Books. But he did about 100 of these illuminated manuscripts. And I saw this decades ago and I went like, I want to do chivalry like that. And there are some visual references to some of Sangorski's work in here. I just fell in love with it. And I love illuminated manuscripts. I've always loved them. And I wanted to bring that to chivalry because illuminated manuscripts are the precursors to comics, I think. I don't think they are comics, but I think they're the precursors to comics. And I'm very appreciative of Neil mentioning my storytelling technique and how I vary it from book to book. I'm interested in the way time is conveyed in static space, how you evoke the sense of the passage of time, speed it up, slow it down, and pause it with pictures. Everything that happens in a comic book isn't moving. You just think it's moving. Now, how do we get the reader to feel the rhythm of time and space with visuals? How do we make them go faster when they want to go faster? How do we make them go slower? Like in Trollbridge, it was important to get a sense of rural time. So I wanted rhythmic images. I wanted to break out the panels and let the pictures flow freely. But when I wanted time to be segmented and discrete, then we go to panels. And because in Snow Glass Apples, everything happens in one character's head. We're hearing somebody's narrative of their memories. So almost everything in the entire book is told without any panels at all. We're hearing a narrator who may be an unreliable narrator. So we're seeing this flow of images. And in Chivalry, in Mrs. Whitaker's life, her life is very regular, regimented, organized. So there are more panels. And then when Sir Galahad shows up and he has his adventures, we break out of the panels and we feel this expansive sensibility and we see the illuminated manuscript pages. So I'm trying to create, yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, don't mean to interrupt you. I was just saying we haven't actually introduced Chivalry yet. This is sort of a big preamble to Chivalry, which is about Mrs. Whitaker, who and it has the immortal opening line, which only a writer of Neil's stature could possibly get away with, which is, every Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Whitaker walked down to the post office to collect her pension. It makes me laugh, Neil, because you have this ability to do deadpan, and yet we know that you're leading us down. It's going to be a magic to collect her pension. Something is going to happen. It always mystifies me how you do it. You always somehow manage to do that.
I'm still. I look at first lines and I love the fact that sometimes I'll go, okay, there was a hand in the darkness and it held a knife. And I go, good, there's a first line. Nobody who read that is ever going to fall off. And then sometimes you just want to do something like Good Omens and start with, it was a nice day. And which has to be the worst first line for grabbing the readers and accept that, people settle down into that. They go, oh, it was a nice day. And then they learn that you're in paradise and you're on the walls of the Garden of Eden. And it's sort of, but it's when you shake people up, it's, you're always trying to lull them into a full sense of security and then, let go of their hand and run away.
But an old lady walking down to the post office to collect her pension. Now, if you were to give that to any editor or any, film producer or television producer who didn't know who you were, they would say, "Yes, young man, go and learn a few things about openings," wouldn't they? And yet somehow you managed to get away with it.
What is lovely though is you can do something like that because Colleen they're holding a book. And it has a knight in shining armor and a little old lady and the Holy Grail on the cover. And they know that these strange, disparate elements are going to encounter each other. It's very weird. Chivalry is probably my best loved short story, and it's had this wonderful afterlife. I wrote it for an anthology on Holy Grails back in about 1990, and during a week that I was stuck on Sandman, I was in the middle of writer's block, and I was incredibly grumpy. And I started writing Chivalry, and it flowed like magic. And I wrote it in a weekend, and then went, aha, my writer's block is done. And I went back on the Monday and started writing Sandman. It was just as awful as it had been the week before. But there was this lovely story that people fall in love with, and it's a very kind story. I think it's not without emotion. It's not without its own small tragedies. But I am fascinated. A few years ago, we did it on the radio with Glenda Jackson and Kit Harington, and it was magic. It's absolute magic.
So should we just go introduce this character who arrives on her doorstep once she has gone down to collect her pension and has taken a detour into a charity shop. Yes, so can we have the picture, please? And Colleen, will you talk us through this introduction and what exactly you're doing in this picture?
Here's Mrs. Whitaker has got herself a nice treasure at the charity shop, and she opens the door one day, and there is this lovely fellow, Sir Galahad, looking for his treasure on a quest. And I remember Neil and me going over how the house should look. We went over that for quite a long time. On some books, we don't consult very much, but on this one, we consulted a great deal because this house was his grandmother's house. It had to be right.
I love the way that there's that witty detail of that in the sort of light, the panel of window over the door, which that particular period of house has, as people who know that sort of architecture, you use that as a speech bubble. And it's full of those sort of things where you just have real wit going on about the way that you're relating the story to the imagery that you've created for it. Neil, talk about this ambiance.
Well, the story, as you say, is about a little old lady who buys the Holy Grail in an Oxfam shop and brings it home, washes it out, puts it on her mantelpiece, and then Sir Galahad, a knight in armor on a quest, a right high and noble quest, turns up on his search for the Holy Grail and says, "Can I have it?" And she says, "No. It looks very nice there." And that really is how the story begins. And it's this very gentle backwards and forwards over several visits between a knight and Mrs. Whitaker. And one of the things that I love about what Colleen has done with the story is it's so gentle, it's so kind, it's so loving, but she manages to open things that were implicit in the short story, but now have flesh, particularly the flashback stuff, moments of Mrs. Whitaker's past a long time ago. One thing about that story is when I wrote it, it was so firmly, it was written in 1989. I think I actually literally wrote it, and it's set in 1989. And it, these days you couldn't get that story to work by updating it because you'd lose all the lovely Second World War stuff. But I love what Colleen did with it. I love that she takes us back in time. She takes us back to, and she shows us young Mrs. Whitaker, who it's such a delight to see. And I kept seeing shadows of Colleen's mum creeping in there in all sorts of different ways.
That's interesting, because there is a little bit of autobiographical stuff in there, isn't there? Particularly Marie, who is the bookshop assistant who meets. And I thought, oh, Neil, you describe her as a little bit overweight. This person who's working in this. I was thinking, Neil, come on, you can't do that these days. And then Colleen reveals at the end that actually this is her. It's a sort of fantasy of her.
Well, back then, everybody was so skinny in the 1980s. If you weighed 115 pounds, people would rib you for being a little chubby. So I remember that. I remember being very thin, but everybody thought you were, people would rib you. The aesthetic was so skinny. So I wanted to get the knight in shining armor, so I put myself in there. That's pretty much what I looked like back in the 1980s, big hair and all, which. That would be
so. Was that actually that she was a little bit overweight? Was that in the original story, Neil, or is that something that
was in the original story? One reason it was there is the story was from Mrs. Whittaker's point of view, and while I love Little Old Ladies, I think Little Old Ladies are the best, and I loved my grandparents, both of my grandmothers. My paternal grandmother was very accepting. My maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, she could have been judgmental for England. If there was an Olympic medal for just sort of judging other people and then quietly letting somebody else know exactly what they got wrong, she had that down like anything. And I thought, I just like the idea that Mrs. Whittaker would have just a little bit of that going on. So when she sees Marie, she just sort of catalogues the first time she sees her, everything that's slightly wrong that she feels that could be fixed with Marie. But and when we meet Marie again, Mrs. Whittaker is much more approving because she's changed in ways that Mrs. Whittaker approves of.
So what is so interesting about that is there is a real relationship going on between you, the writer in 1989, and Colleen, the illustrator, however many years later, 2 decades later, who is internalizing what Mrs. Whittaker thought of Marie all those years ago. And it's a sort of really fascinating discussion going on between you two via the text, which is then coming to us as something that we can't, you try to decode as a reader, but it is definitely enriching of what we're reading.
Colleen was incredibly patient on Chivalry, I should say. Colleen, I think, first asked me if she could do a comics adaptation of Chivalry somewhere in the late 90s. And I had to say no. And she couldn't, because the film rights had been sold at that point. And I'd been I hadn't really been tricked out of them, but they'd gone in ways that I hadn't expected, because I hadn't understood that Hollywood contracts can be dangerous. And really, I didn't think I was ever going to get them back. But Colleen would always check in every few years, and she'd say, "What about Chivalry?" And I'd say, "Oh, no, it's still, the film rights are still there." And then the Hollywood producer who had optioned them wound up going to prison for doing bad things. And all of a sudden, the company that owned them was willing to just give me the rights back. And I got the film rights back. And of course, getting the film rights back meant I had the graphic novel rights back. And so I got to tell Colleen, that thing you've been waiting for 25 years, you can do it now.
You can do it. And I want to just bring it back to the imagery, to the way that Colleen, sitting in the Appalachian Mountains, has managed whenever you did it, so in the last sort of, within this decade, has managed to conjure this England from the late 1980s, and with this extraordinary sort of, it's so rich, and it sort of sent shivers down my spine, because that's exactly the sort of suburbia that I grew up in. So can we have the second picture, and can you describe the details and what was going through your mind, Colleen, when you did it? How you...
Well, you've taken a great load off my mind, because it's one thing to do a book that takes place in another country. I'm not English. It's another thing to do a book that takes place in another country decades ago. And I spent, I don't know how long, researching this material. And Neil and I literally went over, I don't know how many photographs and screenshots of reference, trying to find the right neighborhood, the right houses, the right street, the right everything. I was going mad trying to make sure that the period details were correct. And I only made one error. Fortunately, it's not on this page. That had to be fixed later with Photoshop. But these places all exist. Neil knew what town, what neighborhood, etc. And I just kept looking, and I actually found some photographs that were decades old that I used for reference for this book. It was a real trick. And I hate to make mistakes, so I was going crazy trying not to make any mistakes. It was this, man, oh man, it was rough. And of course, with Mrs. Whitaker's house, she's going to have old things as well. Everything's not, just because she's living in the 1980s doesn't mean that everything in her house is from the 1980s. She's going to have really old furniture. She's going to have an old stove. She's going to have old dishes. She's going to have all this really old stuff. So I was like, okay, it's 1980 something, but she probably bought this in 1950. So now I got to go look up the right stove for that era. It was
let's just look at
really
have the next picture. We have the next picture of the china, which again is my granny's china.
Well, fortunately, it's your granny's china, but it's also mine. This is Blue Willow. I happen to have a complete set of 100-year-old Blue Willow, and I auditioned houses, I auditioned china, and I took pictures of my tea set collections. I have a number of different teapots and bits around the house, and this was the one he chose for Mrs. Whitaker's formal china, and we used the Brown Betty teapot for her everyday teapot. But I sat down and I posed all this stuff. Aren't you happy there's no tea bags?
Oh, no, definitely no tea bags. Yeah, so there is, and you talked about, but it's not just about recreating old stuff, bringing old stuff back to life. It's also part of what we were talking about earlier, creating a palette or an aesthetic. And you talked about auditioning 18 types of gold for the lettering.
Right. So I wanted, gold leaf that we see in illuminated manuscripts, that beautiful flat gold leaf. It doesn't reproduce well. There's some technical weirdness that goes on with gold when you try to scan it. You have to photograph it, but we're in the middle of COVID, and in order to photograph all of the pages of Chivalry and get the gold to show up properly, that was going to cost a fortune, and it's hard to find fine art photographers nowadays. And I live 300 miles away from the nearest photographer. So I was going to have to scan all of this art on a computer. If you scan gold, it looks brown. It doesn't look good at all. So I sat down and I worked with fake golds and real golds. I used an 18 karat gold acrylic made with powdered gold, and I used shell gold instead of gold leaf to see which ones would reproduce best. And then I experimented with how to get them to print shiny. It's this weird, awful technical thing. But ironically, some of the golds that reproduced the best weren't real. And in some cases, I would take the real gold and then I would do a layer of faux gold over the top of it so that they could shine the one through the other and get the best effect. It was a really neurotic thing to do.
We're going to...
I wanted it to be pretty.
We're going to come to audience questions quite soon, but I want to just turn this around a little bit to an issue that I've been very concerned with recently. I wrote a piece for The Guardian this week about book banning in the States. And one thing that I noticed when I was going through all the voluminous lists of books that have been questioned, challenged, or banned, particularly in Texas, an awful lot of graphic novels and an awful lot of Neil's stuff feature on these lists, and I wondered whether there is something about the graphic novel, and that there's the fact that Mouse has been taken off the school shelves in a particular school in Tennessee was what sort of started me thinking about it. That's the Art Spiegelman Mouse, and when I looked into it, it just seemed that there are a lot of challenges against graphic novels, this form that we think of as, joyful, beautiful, child-friendly, but it's obviously morally troubling. Can you explain that to me, Neil?
Well, I think that the simplicity of it is that it is hard to ban a book that is prose because you have to make people actually stop and read prose. And you may have to take a page or a paragraph or a sentence out of context, but it's hard to get people worked up about prose. Whereas comics, being comprised of words and pictures, you have a picture, and it's very easy to grab a picture of something and to go, this is what they're shoving down the throats of our children. And look, it's got homosexuals in it, or trans people in it, or a swear word, or, in the case of Mouse, where you are talking hundreds upon hundreds of pages of biography and memoir about the Holocaust, and somebody found a very small panel of Art Spiegelman's drawing of his mother, who had committed suicide in the bath, and there is a very small body of a naked woman in the bath. They're like, look, there's nakedness in this. There's breasts. And you're just going, how? This is not, no, that's wrong. You're missing the point. But now they had a picture and they could point to it. And I think that is the power of comics, is that they combine words and pictures. The image is really powerful. The danger is that, one of the very first comics I ever wrote very nearly sent a publisher in Sweden to prison. There was a law case. He won, but only just. And that was a Bible adaptation. I still think the only reason that he won the case was the story was literally taken from the Bible, and they couldn't quite bring themselves to go that far. But it's something I've been, very familiar with. Book banning, attempts to ban Sandman. I've had, I remember a police chief in Florida walking into a comic shop and basically saying, if these comics are on the shelves, when I come back here, I'm arresting all of you and closing the shop down. And it's why the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund in America exists and has to exist. And it's why we have librarians fighting for good. And it's why we have Banned Books Week. And it's why we draw attention to this stuff because it doesn't go away, and it seems to me like it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
And Colleen, you've had, apart from Sandman, I mean, I don't know whether your particular Sandman has ever been challenged, the ones you've done, but you've had other DC comics stuff that has been challenged. I mean, Marvel stuff.
Yes,
is that right?
I think the most recent. Yeah, I think I did a graphic novel with an author named Barry Liga. He's a well-known young adult author. It's called Manga Man, and it's about a manga character who comes through a rift in reality into the real world, and this girl falls in love with him, and they start making out, and they decide during the scene not to go all the way. You know, we don't really know each other well enough. We're not ready, but for some reason, some lady went bonzo and tried to get the book banned, and she's like, "Look, there's sex in this book," and I was like, "No, the whole point of the scene is that they don't have sex. They're doing the responsible thing. They're waiting." And, you know, and it was just really weird. That's the most recent incident, but I've had a number of problems. And one of my earliest comics for Marvel, I think it was the first comic I ever did for Marvel Comics, got picked up in the raid that precipitated the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. And it's, again, another weird situation. There's no nudity, there's no sex, there's no strong language, and they picked it up anyway because there was the implication someone might be a lesbian. And it was just, I don't know. I don't get it. I don't know what world we're living in. This is just bizarre to me. So
as Margaret Atwood said of Handmaid's Tale, there's a lot more sex in the Bible. But anyway, we're now going to go over to the audience, and a question from Emily Cole says, for both of you, what, if anything, surprises you about each other's work, specific to Chivalry, after all this time? And it's from Mikala in Vancouver. Hi, Mikala.
I think what surprises me about Colleen's work is that every time I think I know what Colleen does, she does something else. And I just love that. She is a moving target, and she, after however long, all the decades that she's been in this business, which she does not look like she has been, she still has the absolute capacity to surprise, to reinvent herself, and to reinvent herself with the project, to just go, what kind of art does this story need? And then give us that.
Colleen, are you there? I think we might have lost her for a minute. So Neil, I'm going to ask you another question. We'll wait till she comes back. And that's, I love these questions. This is from Nancy in Connecticut. Hello, Nancy. And it's, would your grandmother have put the Holy Grail on the mantle shelf?
No, she probably, well, it would depend if she figured out what it was or not. And one of the things I love about Mrs. Whittaker, of course, is she does. I think my grandmother would probably have found she wouldn't have put it on the mantle, because that was reserved for photographs of her children, grandchildren, and the large shell that she brought back from their holiday to the Bahamas. That was all that was allowed on the mantelpiece. But I think she would have found a windowsill that it would have looked very nice on.
So is she your grandmother? To what extent does she bear a relation to your grandmother?
She's definitely my grandmother-ish. The house that I described was my grandmother's house in Portsmouth in Southsea. And she's sort of 50% lots of old ladies that I would run into in the 80s, including the old lady who lived downstairs from us in Nutley, where I wrote the story, who and also she's my grandmother. Definitely my maternal grandmother, not my paternal grandmother. She's social in the way that my grandmother was. The macaroons are my grandmother's, and the way that she would, and both, the one thing I borrowed from both of my grandmothers was their insistence on feeding you.
Yeah.
And not just feeding you, but giving you food wrapped in, very often giving you food wrapped either in silver paper or in just used paper bags. They would reuse things for later. So you would get given a slice of cake for later, or whatever they happened to have, biscuits, and you couldn't visit my grandmother's and then leave without having to take food with you.
I love the way that food is evoked, and the picture of liver and onions sent a sort of shiver down my spine, a shiver of memory, taste memory. It's full of those sort of details. Welcome back, Colleen. We lost you for a little while there. So I'm going to put to you the other. I'm sure it's something to do with that bear in the background. Must have trodden on your wires or something. So you, what is it about Neil's work that surprises you, which Neil's already answered about yours? And you don't know what he said about you, so you can...
I don't. I'll have to find this out later. His economy of language and how much he says by being understated. I love that about Neil's work. There's a really great moment in Chivalry that you have to be a complete King Arthur nerd to get. And it's when Galahad shows up with the Philosopher's Stone. If you are a super King Arthur nerd, the way I am, you know that sometime around, I don't know, the 11th, 12th century, one of the earliest King Arthur tales does not have the Holy Grail as a cup. It's the Philosopher's Stone. It was written by Wolfram von Eichenbach. It is the only version of the Holy Grail stories in which the Holy Grail isn't a cup or a platter or something. In that one story, it's the Philosopher's Stone. So there's a scene in there where Galahad shows up trying to trade an ancient version of the Holy Grail for this latter version of the Holy Grail. I think that's hilarious. It's just going to go right over the heads of most people, but it's delightful for me. And he just puts it right there in front of you. And it's one of these wonderful little Easter egg moments that you will get if you have the right knowledge about what to get. And it just makes me so happy that there are little bombs like that all over Neil's stories. It's just like reading a puzzle. I love it when that happens.
Yeah, it's a real quality you have, Neil. Of you never. I think when I was reviewing The Ocean at the End of the Lane, I was thinking you never patronise. There's always some. There's as much depth as you choose to look for, and as much experience as you have that you can bring to the text, which always seems to be one of the marks of one of your anything that you write. I'm going to move on to Pam McKinnon, who's a high school English teacher, who says that their graphic novel at her school, their graphic novel unit is the most loved ones for students in schools. And the question is, does your process for writing a graphic novel differ from that of a novel? In what ways do you anticipate, plan, imagine the graphic aspects to convey meaning? There's a question that's clearly going to go back to the classroom.
Well, when I'm writing something that is intended to be comics from the off, I'm going to be sitting and thinking about it in terms of panels and imagery. I'm probably not going to ever go and wax philosophical, because it's very hard to wax philosophical if you just have a block of text suddenly, and you never want a block of text. So you always want things. I always want to give artists interesting things to draw. One of my starting point for working with an artist is normally to call them up and say, what do you like to draw? What have you always wanted to draw that nobody's ever given you to draw? And what do you hate drawing? And sometimes those things can be an absolute revelation. But they can also guide you, because if you're working with an artist, you want them to do their best work because they're going to make you look good.
Mm. So actually leading on from that very nicely, a question from Shirley Ann Duff, which is Colleen, which of Neil's works do you wish you'd illustrated that you haven't? And then following on from that, Neil, which of your works would you love Colleen to have illustrated, which she hasn't? So Colleen.
I would have sacrificed a goat in order to have drawn the Orpheus chapter of Sandman. Chivalry was the big one for me. That was my Holy Grail story. I loved that story so much. It actually kind of hurt at the thought of me never getting to do that tale. I would get weepy about it, thinking about it. I was just like, please, 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 please. But the one that got away from me was Orpheus. I wasn't the best Sandman artist back then. I think I certainly do it a lot better now. But that one, really wanted that one. Yeah.
So Neil, what would you like Colleen to have illustrated?
Well, of stories that other people have drawn, I would have loved to have seen Colleen's take on murder mysteries, which was illustrated by P. Craig Russell. And Craig Russell is a genius, and Craig is brilliant and wonderful. But in that same way that you have a song that's played by somebody and you go, wouldn't it be great if somebody else did a cover version? And I wonder what their version of that song would be like. I would have loved to have seen Colleen's version of this sort of strange, it's a murder mystery set in heaven before the fall. And I would have loved to have seen what Colleen did with all of these angels and an angel private eye. So of stories that nobody's ever illustrated, there's a book we brought out about a year ago called The Neil Gaiman Reader, where it has about 50-something short stories of mine and extracts from novels. And all of them were voted for by people on the internet. Well, all of the short stories were, we just took the 50 that got the most votes and put them in. And I only put my thumb on the scales once, because there was a short story I'd written called Monkey and the Lady, which was a sort of little fable that appeared in a book that nobody had ever read, but that I loved. And I'd love to see what Colleen would do with Monkey and the Lady.
Well, there we go. We have the future, part of the future mapped up for us, hopefully. Neil, this is a question going back to Chivalry. What is it about this book that makes it unique from all your past stories? And is there a special part of the story that you cherish the most? And I think this is from Enville from Georgia, US. Hi, Enville. I wonder whether this is I've been wondering about what your particular fascination this is for both of you actually with Arthurian stories, and whether that's partly what the unique thing is about this.
The story itself, there's, on the one hand, you write a story, and I just remember thinking, little old lady finds the Holy Grail, and Sir Galahad turns up on a quest. That's a story. I'll write it and see what happens. And I had no idea where the story was going, how it would end, really almost what it was about, other than I had that as an idea, and I just let the story follow its own logic to the end. And they don't always do that. I didn't have to work hard. but I also then discovered for myself how lovable the story is, because I started doing it at public readings, and it wins over audiences. They make the same noises every time. They get more and more comfortable. They get happy. They get sad. They applaud wildly at the end. And it's like going, oh, okay, I made this thing that's a kind of a happiness machine. I didn't know, but it does that. And I think one of the things about the graphic novel is that I've been getting to experience the story myself in a way that I never really normally get to do. As Colleen's beautiful pages have been coming in, as I got to sit and proofread it, I read it and went, actually, this is making me kind of emotional. And I wrote the story. I've read it aloud, probably at this point in my life 500 times. And yet I'm reading this thing that Colleen has made of my story, and I'm getting kind of sniffy, and it's actually doing things. And that, I think, for me was the revelation.
Thank you. I was half wondering about going back to one of the images. Actually, I think maybe we will. Can we go back to have the final image of the horse and apple of Hesperides, Tanya, who is the secret person in the background who's making this all happen. And can you just talk about this? It's one of the explosive images, which I think summons up what Neil has been saying about this amazing imagination that Colleen has brought to this story.
Well, first of all, thank you, Neil, for saying that. I can't ask for a better compliment. I'm getting weepy now. This is obviously one of my favorite pages. I've been dreaming about drawing the sequence so long, and I just thoroughly enjoyed everything about doing this page. It's done with iridescent watercolors, which of course you can't see in front of you. You can't see the effects in print, and there's also gold on this, but it shimmers in the light when you get to see it. In fact, the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco is going to be doing an exhibit of the original art. So that's going to start in late April and run through September. So you'll get a chance to see it there if you like. But being able to do some of these extended fantasy sequences is a dream come true for me, especially in this book. I loved everything about doing the scene. Boy, I don't even know what else to say. This is just pure joy for me. That's a good
the horse. Of course, this beautiful silver horse, a grey horse, plays a very, for me, I'm as a horse lover, it sort of has this. It is a character in the novel for me, and it also is a reference because you're referring to pre-Raphaelite art, that wonderful tradition of sort of those very theatrical pre-Raphaelite Arthurian pictures. We're running out of time, so I'm going to put a very Guardian question to both of you from Phil Warren, which is, considering the behaviour of some of the world leaders at the moment, is chivalry dead? Neil.
If it isn't dead, it's very, very sick, and it's not looking healthy. The world, I'm old enough and I've read enough to know that the world does not move forward in time at a steady, sensible, evolving, changing pace. Instead, it moves in pendulum swings, and things swing, and then they swing back, and then they swing too far, and then they'll swing back again in some direction and swing too far. I think right now what the world needs is not necessarily chivalry. I actually think what the world needs right now from its leaders is kindness and empathy. And I would trade some chivalry for a lot of kindness and a large suitcase full of empathy for them.
And a question for Colleen, final, very, very final one. What is the best thing you've ever picked up in a charity shop? another very Guardian question.
Well, a Chanel handbag, which yay, that was pretty awesome. I actually buy a lot of stuff in charity shops. I buy almost all of my clothes in charity shops. I'm a big believer in recycling. I grow a lot of my own food. I I'd rather save my money for art, honestly. I don't want to spend a lot of money on stuff I don't need to spend a lot of money on. I got, some wonderful books in charity shops. I'm always in them, probably at least once a month. I'm turning into Mrs. Whitaker.
Oh, you see, this was the ploy all along. We wanted to see your inner Mrs. Whitaker. And I'm afraid we'll have to leave it on that note because we've run out of time. We could go on talking all evening, clearly. But I hope and I'm very sorry if I've missed some of your questions, which were all great. I really appreciate you being there. And a huge thanks to Neil and Colleen for being so generous with their insights and with their being so honest and candid. And if you haven't yet read it, I would absolutely recommend it. Chivalry is out now, and you need to give it to everyone, and you will be people's friends forever. They will never forget it. Now, Guardian Live have a lot more coming up, which you're very welcome to join us for, including interviews with Hannah Gadsby, Julian Barnes and Lisa Tadeo. You can find out more at theguardian.com/Guardian Live. We'd love to hear what you think of this event, so do fill out the survey at the end. And lastly, thanks to you, the audience, for your brilliant questions and for joining us today. And huge thanks to Neil and Colleen. Good night, and I do very much hope that we'll meet up again soon.
I hope so. Thank you, Claire.
Bye.